Welcome to the Staff in Trenchcoat. I'm Raymond Magdallan, here as always with my co host Pope Jupiter.
Good evening.
Today we are going to be talking about the fifth season, the first book in the Broken Earth. I believe it's a trilogy, and that is by N.K. Jemisin. And we are going to just, as we've done the last couple episodes, we are going to jump right into our discussion of the book. There will be spoilers, even perhaps a few spoilers from the first chunk of the second book. So keep that in mind if you are not wanting to have anything ruined for you. We're gonna discuss all the ins and outs. So let's jump right in with I guess just your first impressions, Pope. How did you enjoy this one as compared with some of the other novels that we've covered in the show?
Well, compared to the other novels we've done, this was certainly more enjoyable than with Way of Kings or Knight Errant. So this is the best book you've chosen thus far, Magdalene. Kudos. Um, it was a fun book at parts. I would say overall, if I didn't know how apparently important this book was, I think my opinion of it would be higher. But apparently, people who are much more credentialed than me really like this book, and it baffles me.
Yeah, as I said to you before we started the show, I had this book recommended to me in grad school, and I had no idea who had written it. I mean, obviously, I knew the name from the cover of the book, but I purchased a hard copy. I think I read 50 pages and bounced off of it. And then at some point between, I don't know, 2018 and now, I also purchased the Audible version and tried to listen to part of it and bounced off of it a second time. And it was only now, for the purposes of this project, when I chose the book, that I researched the author a little bit and became a little bit more aware of all of that side of things. And obviously, since we were going to do this episode, I didn't have the option to bounce off of it. So I did make it all the way through, of course. And for me, it was strikingly mid. I actually disagree. I think I did enjoy The Way of Kings more for for a lot of reasons, especially if we are reprising our discussion from that episode where if The Way of Kings was not so bloated and huge, if it had just been a shorter narrative, then I think it would have blown the fifth season out of the water. But I guess maybe if we're taking it as a situated sort of experience, yeah, I guess it was pretty close, but it was neck and neck. I think between those two, and we'll save the comparison to Knight Errant. I think for the end of the episode. But so, what did you make of the style, the way that she chooses to write her prose?
I'll be honest, it reeked of too clever. The third of the book that is in whatever person it would be where the author refers to the main character as you is kind of interesting, but I don't really know that she does anything interesting with it.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, I'm not sure if it sort of came off to me as though the narrator in those chapters is the Stone Eater, and so he's sort of writing at the character in that sense. But at least on a first read, it came off to me as though I was being like the fourth wall was being broken, and I was being expressly told as a reader to inhabit this character, and I admit I resented that immediately.
I didn't really resent it so much as just I just didn't really get it. That's not true. Um, I wasn't sure if she was going for and obviously it became obvious quickly what she was going for, but at first I was a little confused about whether, like, is this supposed to be the part where, like, I didn't realize at first that it was going to be like a third of the book. At first, I thought it might have just been kind of an expository section or something. but yeah, that just felt, and it also felt like it was a way to deliberately limit information because by telling that section of the story that way, the author doesn't have to explain things that you already know, but the reader doesn't necessarily know that.
Yeah, I would say the whole novel, her, whatever you want to call it, her mastery or her finesse in the department of withholding information, it did not inspire wonder in me as a reader. I wasn't sitting there going, I want to imagine what the answers might be, and I'm looking forward to the reveal. It was merely frustrating. I don't think she did that well. It didn't inspire the types of wonder that are generally endemic to the fantasy genre. It it just seemed intentional and cumbersome.
And one thing, speaking of writing style, I don't know if this is what she was going for. The way the some of the concepts are constructed, like the myths. There were a couple others where it was clear that this was instead of calling them scientists, they're just myths because they're chemists or biologists or um, whatever. They all are some sort of mist. But it ends up making the whole world feel like a cargo cult because they're just like the ist in chemist or scientist that has a meaning that comes from like Greek or something. Like there's a reason we use that. And I don't know, I feel like a better use of something like that would be to examine something like that, how a word uh, can morph like that from a standalone word in Greek that is used in normal conversation to a word that describes a field of study and uh, knowledge that then morphs from being used in that second way into a whole other class of words, a whole other lexicon. I think that is an interesting idea to explore, and I think that's something that could be done well. Maybe even N.K. Jemisin could do it well, but it's not done well in The Broken Earth.
Well, let's open it up a little bit. This isn't in our list of discussion topics, but it probably should have been. What do you make of the use cast system that she employs, and also the com system, and sort of like the general organization of the fragmented society that exists in the stillness?
It strikes me as one of my least favorite kinds of civilizations, ones that require the large portions of the populace to just be dumb sheep for no reason. And maybe this is a bit unfair of me, but it feels like to they it feels like they just kind of blindly follow the stone lore, and it feels like there's some indication that there are people in the stillness who do question the stone lore. I don't know. It feels like it was something that was created nefariously, but by people who no longer exist. I don't know if I'm being clear here, if I'm just rambling.
You're certainly verging on ramble, but I was following you thus far.
I mean, essentially, it's a world where you could argue that because there are these people, the world seems to be seismically unstable for some reason because of something humanity allegedly did. And I'm sure this is explored in further in the series, but it's not made clear what it is in this book that I could see. So you could argue that this is a people who are in a constant state of baseline survival, so they wouldn't necessarily have much cause to question the lore, but there are places that exist long term and are prosperous and relatively safe. There actually seem to be many places in the stillness that are relatively calm and safe and prosperous. And these places seem to also rigorously, almost religiously, adhere to the stone lore, but not in a way that, at least as far as we are shown, they disproportionately benefit from. So it doesn't make sense in an exploitation sense. So why is this still? Why is it not being questioned? It's again, these may be answered in further books, but they're just left on the table in this one and not adequately addressed, in my opinion.
Yeah, there's a lot that I could say here. I I found myself unclear, so I'll just ask it in a rapid fire set of questions. Do you think that the book was making a religious argument? Because I personally I got some weird religious undertones in the text that I almost got the impression that we might be dealing with somebody who is has at least one foot in the door of Christianity.
That's difficult for me to say. I The only real overtly religious vibes I got was from the discussion of the stone lore. Um
But I mean that's pretty prevalent. I mean it bookends every chapter in the novel.
right.
I mean you have this entire world ostensibly where we are given these end notes to every chapter that are, and maybe this is a function of the audible version, but the narrator really ramps up the gravitas when she's reading these sections from the stone lore. Whenever a character mentions them, it is generally with some reverence, and most of them are, they're often kind of obvious, generally obvious type directional factoids, I guess. That I was unable to decouple, I guess, from the underpinnings of the obvious line between that and the Ten Commandments being written on stone and setting up an underpinning for the way that Christians are supposed to live.
Yeah, and especially Alabaster's reference to the fifth tablet. There's only 3 tablets that you've seen. I don't know if that's what he explicitly says, but that's the implication.
Yeah, and it very much it seemed like the stone lore is a stand-in for these are the words of the gods, of God, whatever. They are presented in a way that made me take them seriously as a reader, and the characters when they reference them seem to position them as a useful guide for staying alive and being a good person in the stillness. I guess another way to frame it would be to say I was expecting there to be anti-religious undertones, but at the very least, I felt that it was neutral. But the weird stone lore element that ran through the novel made me feel a little bit as though you could potentially make the argument that one thing that's being intentionally or otherwise conveyed in the narrative is that as the world goes to shit, that you have to kind of fall back on quasi-religious teachings in order to survive.
I guess my thoughts on that are that, like, the stone lore is not necessarily correct. I mean, yes, it makes some valid directions, but I guess one of my things is it's do not depend on metal; it will rust and fail. Which I was expecting some sort of like rust eating, some sort of like metal eating monster, to be honest. Not necessarily literal monster, but some sort of something that would make metal especially weak as a defense. But like it just goes on to say, wood and stone shall last. And it's like, yeah, but like metal works really well as a gate and a wall because you can't burn it, and it generally doesn't break the way stone does. And like there's all these reasons why metal is a superior building material. And it's like, well, yeah, metal can rust, but not if you maintain it. And there are materials we can build out of that don't rust.
Well, and this is far outside of my area of expertise, but doesn't acid rain destroy stone?
Yes.
Okay. Because throughout the whole novel, I kept reading these passages and going, okay,
And it does even worse things to wood, to be clear.
yeah, I thought it actually did damage to stone structures faster than it would do damage to well constructed man made metal fortifications.
For sure.
So I don't want to be so arrogant as to just be like she didn't do her research, but my layman's understanding of the way that acid rain would work, if we're assuming that, because of course in post the argument could just be made, well, in the stillness the acid rain is of a particular quasi magic set of properties, or it's way more concentrated in a specific type of compound that is more corrosive to metal than it is to stone. But I didn't, that wasn't made explicit. So I was assuming that we were talking about essentially mundane acid rain, and I just didn't buy it. I was like, okay, I mean, yeah, the acid rain will over time it'll eat through the paint and damage the outer layers, but it's not just gonna liquefy a 10-foot thick, metal gate.
No. And if it's going to liquefy a metal gate, I mean, it's going to do the same thing to a wood gate, only faster. And a stone gate may hold up longer, but that's only because they tend to be pretty dense. Pretty, you tend to make gates and walls out of big, thick hunks of stone. But something like a home is not going to have big, thick hunks of stone unless that's the prescribed building method. So it's going to, you're going to end up a bunch of, so if you build everything out of stone and the acid rain comes, it's gonna eventually destroy people's roofs. And by eventually, I mean eventually in this storm. Like the walls and stuff will be fine for a year or two. I would say a season or two, but apparently that means different things in this book.
At least in terms of the fifth seasons can be, that seems like a stand-in for just like an apocalyptic era.
My impression of it was maybe kind of a volcanic winter.
Yeah, that seemed to be at least one of the components of it, but the duration of it seemed to be wildly variable.
Right. Which I mean that can happen with bad volcanic activity. I don't know what kind of I feel like any kind of volcanic activity that would lead to as Cyan says at the end of the book, or near the end of the book, this will be 1,000-year long season. That much volcanic activity would probably cause massive geological changes because you're belching out a lot of magma onto the surface. If you're putting that much ash into the air to cause 1,000-year winter.
Yeah, and so I mean, without belaboring it, I the acid rain thing seemed weird, the stone thing seemed weird, and I did pick up, I guess what I'll call a the position on religion seemed to be ill defined, if there was any position being taken by the narrative, and maybe it was my own assumptions about the way that the text would treat that type of dogma that are to blame, but it seemed like there was at least a neutral but potentially even a positive view on at least sort of, forgive the pun, but bedrock religious, dogmatic ideological precepts as being potentially positive. But the follow up question is, how do you feel like this book handled the generally, I guess you would call it, sort of anarcho syndicalist organization of the society? Because it seemed to me that maybe this was one element of the book that was apocalyptic in the sense that when I imagine a syndicate based quasi anarchist society, this is like the absolute worst case scenario.
Yeah, this seems less of a deliberate union of free people coming together to form an anarchically organized society versus a group of people brought together by dire circumstances who are forced to create a kind of syndicalist society, but they still replicate many of the hierarchies they that we would recognize from our world. We still have a mayor, we still have governors, we still have senators or nobles, dukes, earls, what have you. There's still a president or king or prime minister or whatever the fuck the leaders are. You know, there's still this hierarchy of leadership. It seems like a perversion of an anarcho syndicalism. Like it's like someone who hates anarcho syndicalism writing a story about anarcho syndicalists.
Yeah, I guess like that's what I'm driving at is that the book seemed vaguely pro religious dogma and maybe even more overtly arguing against anarchist theory. To not to get too far in the weeds with that, but I think that if you were a I'm putting myself in the position of a religiously minded person with kids or teenagers or whatever. I'm not sure what I guess this was probably written for adults. It does have some pretty graphic uh, sexual content. But if I was trying to recommend a book to somebody that I thought had a neutral or better religious view and that would stick it to the the libs and the internet anarchist boys, this book would fit the bill, right?
Yeah, for sure.
And I mean, if her intention was to set up like a syndicalist or an anarchist, like if she was trying to write this in a positive way that would show the potential for anarchistic organization in a post-apocalyptic world, then she failed. But it seems to me that I mean it almost read to me like sort of warning that if our systems fail, that this might be what we have to look forward to is that the dogmatic religious stone texts would remain, and we would be plunged into a syndicalist esque organization where people get segmented off into these use castes, where John is a strong back, and Mary Sue is a leadership, and so is a what do they call them, hunters or warriors or what. I think there were, I don't know, like what, 5 or 10 different uh,
Yeah, there are like
classes.
7, I think. There's a specific line. That's not one of the 7 recognized use casts.
Yeah, that's
Um,
right. It was like the 7 recognized, and then there were like 5 old. Uh,
yeah.
and I don't know. I hated it. I didn't enjoy it. I didn't think it was cool. I thought it was lazy. It just wasn't for me, man. The strong back thing and the it just didn't make any sense that you can't, I don't think, even if you've just read one or two, let's not even say books, let's just say journal, not even journal articles, just like internet blogs
You've
about,
watched a couple of YouTube videos.
yeah, that in any kind of anarchistic organization like that, in these comms or whatever, it has to be it has to be merit based. You can't just like, they'd all die. Uh, and I mean, it seemed like there were physical differences too, to some degree, right? Because the strong backs they were just all like bigger, and they had a certain like bone structure. And am I remembering correctly?
I think so. I think there was some I don't know that there was that much variance between the use casts outside of like the strong backs were physically more stronger and bigger. I do know there was a lot of emphasis put on Sansid heritage, uh,
Yeah, I recall that.
which seemed to be just bigger. I don't remember much about coloring, except that it seemed like Sansid were actually darker, and they just tended to be bigger.
Yeah, and it's not made explicit if that is a result of like they got fed the most or they had training or whatever, but it seemed as though you were born into whatever role it was that you were going to take on, and then you just kind of knew if you were of a certain use cast that if shit got bad, they were just going to kick you out. Again, I just don't think it just didn't smack to me of being believable. In that I don't think that society would orient itself that way because it would not yield because the entire Stone Lore thing, it's kind of all set up as though there was like a certain traditional pragmatic wisdom that was guiding the choices that they made. But the idea that you just certain people are the people who guard the gate, and certain people are just born to be politicians, and other people are just born to be scientists. That just isn't that wouldn't work in a low population situation where you were trying to survive. You would want the
No, the
people.
leadership cast would last approximately 7 minutes
Right.
before everyone stronger than them said, "Hey, all that gold and shit you got is all cool, but we got the food. So if you want food, you're gonna get down here in the muck with the rest of us."
And I mean there was maybe some loose hinting that there was a hierarchy, like an imperial hierarchy that existed that would enforce the use cast because your comm has to be recognized. So it seemed like that maybe in future volumes she's going to elaborate more on how that structuring of society is sort of made to continue, even though on the face of it, to me, it just read like again somebody who just didn't had not been exposed to much anarchist theory and was trying to write about it, or somebody who had read a lot of it, who was trying to write a fantasy book that was antagonistic to anarchist theory. Because again, I mean, even just to be really pithy about it, the precept of to each what they need, from each what they're able, is completely thrown out the window by this organization. It is very much more whatever caste you belong to is the I don't know. It just I'm trying to be as fair as I can, but I guess I'll just say it the way I feel, which is it reads to me like a hillbilly that you'll hear saying like, well, in the if the anarchists had their way, they would just tell you what job you just have to be a sewage sweeper for your entire life because they just pick your job for you. Manifest as a fantasy novel.
I usually hear that about communists. Anarchists are usually just here to burn everything down,
Well,
but
I'm giving them the benefit of the doubt, I guess, or the inverse of that, in that normally when the people that I've had the misfortune of having these discussions with use the word communism, it's interchangeable with anarchism or socialism, or it's just kind of the one. They just pick one of those three words and they all stand in for each other. Is I don't like.
absolutely. It really means anything to the left of hunting poor people for sport.
Well, and it seemed like that at a certain point, it was kind of implied that after a certain point they would hunt the comless and eat them, right? Wasn't that kind of the undertone?
I don't know that I ever got that specific undertone from it.
All right, well, maybe that was my own. Maybe I overread.
I mean, there may have been a an implication that that was something they would sometimes resort to, but I don't recall any specific time where it was indicated that was done out of anything other than necessary survival.
Right. Well, and much of what's been said about the novel focuses around her exploration of systemic oppression. And it's also true that her exploration of the post apocalyptic landscape and the ecological situation that she's also extending it to describing a post-apocalyptic social event, and the use cast system seems to be, it could just be that that was what she imagined as being a worst case scenario, and that the novel is sort of, for lack of a better phrase off the top of my head, sort of like warning us against this potential perversion. I'm just not convinced that, yeah, this comes up in every episode, so I guess it's sort of a hallmark of the way that I just, discuss these novels, but it it didn't pass my suspension of disbelief test. I wasn't able to buy into the way that the use cast thing was set up as being a realistic long term system by which people would allow themselves to be governed.
No, especially when you have an entire cast that also seems to be pretty much disposable, whose defining trait is their strength and physical fortitude.
Yeah, and it doesn't come up, but I was often wondering, well, what if one of these strongbacks or whatever is, intelligent and inclined towards the study of politics and so on and so forth? They just, nope, you're a strongback, so like that's just what you are. It just doesn't seem,
And
because I
again,
mean,
there's the thread of a good social commentary there because that is something as a larger physically individual that I have felt my whole life. I've been more drawn to intellectual pursuits, but I've always been told, "Oh, you should be a football player. You should work in a warehouse or a factory or what have you. You should do these big physical, strong back type things." Unfortunately, I live in a society where I can choose to not do those things and get paid less money instead.
well, but even in the most deplorable civilizations that we could summon forth, if you were such a person but you displayed aptitude, they would use you for your aptitude.
Right. Absolutely. The most rigid caste systems in history are replete with stories of lower caste people cleverly making their way into higher castes. It's and many of them are even based on true stories. So it's definitely something that happens in those castes. So, and it's entirely plausible that it's the same in this case, but it definitely doesn't seem to be the case.
No, and it's also possible that there is a commentary there that has to do with race. And as we've said, I maybe this was a function of listening to the audiobook instead of, reading it, and maybe I missed some of it, but I just wasn't really clear on which characters were part of which racial group, and it seemed like the caste system was not being defined purely upon racial lines. And so if that was the, i.e., if the author was trying to make the case that, if all of the strongbacks were a certain color and from a certain region, then that would sort of change the way that I would be approaching my thoughts about the use cast system. But that didn't seem to be the case.
Yeah, and to go back to your point about cross cast exploitation, we do actually have an example of a leadership cast who wants to be, I guess, an innovator cast, and she's able to do this, but in doing so, her family disowns her. And I just feel like, in what world would a society organized around what society would want to expel a member of their family who was involved in innovation, in research and creating new things, new technologies, new information. Sure, maybe the families of Oppenheimer and the guys who invented the nuclear bomb, maybe they didn't, go out and celebrate their their family member's accomplishment. But we're not saying that anyone in the innovator class is creating nuclear weapons. It just didn't make sense why this leadership class wouldn't want to have the potential value of an innovator in the family, someone who can create new things and I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, to I don't know, I guess put a period on it. It seemed like there was some argument being made in the text, by way of the use cast system, but I was not able as a reader to get past. I guess just my skepticism about that type of a system ever actually manifesting, even in a post-apocalyptic. Excuse me, in a post-apocalyptic scenario. Yeah, I guess that's all I'll say about that. I didn't enjoy that facet of the novel. I thought it detracted. And so let's jump to identity. Let's talk a little bit about that.
I mean, the gimmick of the story is that you think for like 2/3 of the book that it is three different stories in potentially three different timelines. Although I assumed that the uh, child sections were concurrent with the science sections. I assumed that Cyan would meet the little girl and that shenanigans would ensue or something. Finding out that Cyan was the little girl definitely put a different perspective on things. And apparently, this is one of the first major points where you and I disagree because I actually kind of dug that that gimmick. It definitely was a little bit clever, but I enjoyed it. Apparently, you did not as much.
No, I think I made the comment to you the other day that speaking strictly in terms of fantasy, basically every system at play, Jameson did all of the things that I hate.
Yes,
And
I believe what you said was she did everything I hate like she was following a checklist.
yep, and so one of those things is, and again, I don't. There's just no way for me to say this. I guess that doesn't come off as arrogant, but I was not fooled. I knew immediately that what we were dealing with was a narrative where she was playing with time and sort of offsetting the those different parts of the narrative, and I thought it was pretty obvious that it was the same person because of course you had a little girl, a 20-year-old, and then a 40-year-old, and so it made the little reveals that happened were I thought, to use our cheesy versus campy, it was cheesy. I just didn't dig it. And it just seemed I wasn't able to figure out what was made better by convoluting the story in this way that would have been lost if the story had just been told in a linear fashion. What am I supposed to learn, or what insight was I supposed to gain from these three narratives being told simultaneously and sort of interweaving as they did? And I was not able to come up with that answer. It just seemed like and again, just all cards on the table. It felt to me like this was a tactic that was being used to make the fantasy story seem more, I'm thumbing my nose, like, high literature. Like, oh, the academics will like this. I'll do it this way because if I just tell the story from beginning to end, then it won't it won't stand up against the other books that are in the academically accepted canon.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was talking about with too clever. It's a gimmick. It's a gimmick that kind of worked on me. I'm not gonna try to lie here and say, oh, yeah, yeah, I saw it. No, I was completely suckered that I thought this was three different people, and I still thought it was two different people until the explicit reveal that Assoon was Cyan. But but yeah, I get what you're saying. It definitely is a gimmick and is something that I guess it's up to the reader whether it's too clever or just clever enough.
Well, and I mean, that's I'm not going to yuck your yum. If you enjoyed that, then that's great. That's totally fine. And if I tried to argue against my own position, I would say that the the way that the narrative is set up, it does force you to go back and think about the events that happened again in a way that you might not if it was just told from beginning to end in a straight line, especially if you get blindsided by the reveals and then you're thinking back and going, "Oh, okay, well this character that is now saying these things and taking these actions is the same character that did this," and you're remembering these scenes that you might not have reminisced about in a standard front to back linear narrative. There could certainly be some value in that. For me, it read too gimmicky. I almost wonder if it was an issue of I would be taking your position if it was, maybe if the child and the 20-year-old, if that part had been told in a linear way, and then the reveal was that the 40-year-old was the same character. It was two instead of three. That maybe I would have bought in more. But and again, I don't want to get too into the weeds on it. But again, I got the focus on threes is a pretty common religious touchstone, and so it was another thing where I was kind of going, okay, we have kind of like a Messiah thing going on. There's the three narratives. There's the stone lore it sort of dragged me down.
I mean, threes is pretty prevalent everywhere. It's not really just a religious thing, but it is also very prevalent in especially Christian mythology or Christian, yeah, mythology. I was right. But yeah, it's I think it's a gimmick that probably will not work on me again. This may be an instance of a relative experience. I don't know that I've read a book that did this particular gimmick necessarily. So, or at least I don't think I've read it without knowing that that was the gimmick. But I don't know that this would be something that would work on me again because I think when if I read another book where I encounter, you know, a maid, a matron, and a crone again, I'm going to assume they're the same person.
I like that maid, matron, and crone.
I mean, that's the classic trinity for especially for women.
So let me draw your attention then back to Way of Kings, where I would argue he was kind of doing a fairly similar organization of his text, but just without veiling it. So we had Kaladin as the young man, and then we had Kaladin. I guess it was only two and not three. There was a similar thing happening where you had the young version of the character that had his own narrative, and then you had the adult version of the character that was having its own narrative, and he was weaving them together throughout the course of the text. And I feel like I remember you hating that in Way of Kings. So do you just think that Jemisin's method of the sort of keeping it hush hush for most of the novel, and then also doing it in three sections instead of two, was just a better execution? Or would you say that it was a different mechanism entirely? I.e., did Sanderson's method come off to you more as just inane flashbacks as opposed to Jameson's interwoven tri narrative?
I think it is just that Jameson's narrative is better. Like I think that certainly her brevity speaks to her strength relative to Sanderson, but no, I definitely recognize that it is certainly playing in the same ballpark, even if it's not the exact same gimmick. But and I could you could argue that there's something of young Kaladin, present Kaladin, and then Ned Stark at home. I can never remember his fucking name. Is
Dalinar, right?
Dalinar is that's good enough for our purposes. Is the old man, you know, the maid, matron, and crone for men. from that perspective. But I mean, that's an analytical lens that I don't know that I'm interested in concerning being concerned about. You know, that specific aspect of storytelling. I think it's interesting done. I thought it was interesting done here because of how different the characters are, at least outwardly. And again, that just may be my inexperience, but I feel like I'm being defensive by saying I enjoyed the gimmick. I'm not trying to be defensive. I just don't have anything else to say at this point.
Oh no, I mean that's. I think it is in this case. I'm not making like an academic pronouncement on her choice to create the narrative that way. I'm just saying that my preference is a well written narrative in linear order, generally speaking. And just as I would also say, like, but one of my pet peeves that Sanderson did a bunch was you get done with a chapter and then it just says 5,000 years later, and the next chapter just begins from these giant time jumps. I don't particularly care for that either. So it is purely just a preference based critique, and so it's valuable to hear that it didn't ring that way to you. That you enjoyed the organization of her narrative. Let
Yeah,
me.
I'm generally a sucker for non-linear narratives, to be honest. I love stories that begin like 10 seconds before the ending and then spend the rest of the book getting up to that point. That's just the kind of stories I tend to like, so non-linear narratives work for me. But I understand if you prefer a linear narrative that it would be a turnoff for sure.
Yeah, if I had to try and articulate it a different way, I would say that in a narrative like Jemisin's, I did not feel as though the characters were growing or developing as I read, but they were being revealed as I read. And I guess it makes me feel less like I am able to see myself in the character and experience their growth because I know that in the next chapter or the one after that I'm just going to be given the next chunk of character development, and it seems less organic to me in that way.
Yeah, I remember thinking when I read The Three Musketeers in high school, God, early writers had it so easy. No one knew that you could write characters that like were characters and had growth and personalities.
I never read The Three Musketeers. I only ever saw the movie.
Literally any movie adaptation, including the Disney one with Kiefer Sutherland and Oliver Platt, is better than the book because the book is a bunch of fucking cardboard good guys who literally can do no wrong, defeating a bunch of bad guys who literally can never succeed. It's that fucking bland and basic.
Hell yeah.
So but it's also like 500 years old. So it's one of the few novels that have lasted that long.
Okay, so let's pivot and let's talk about sex and sexuality in the novel.
I thought this was a very mature book on the subject of both sex and sexuality. I mean, it didn't try to pretend that people don't like sex, but also definitely had something that I think is somewhat rare in literature, which is dudes who don't want to bone, or at least a dude who doesn't want to bone. And turns out it's because he's mostly gay.
Well, I guess I had thought that you would immediately key in on the forced breeding that then transitions into affection.
Oh yeah.
Because I
I
gotta say that was that gives me that's a big cringe.
oh yeah. That was and I believe I called that. I believe I said that it was tickling my. It didn't quite go into the full actual loving lovers. It didn't quite go that far. But it did get to the point where enemies to lovers. Like, I hate that fucking trope because you gotta put a lot of work in to make it make sense.
Well, and I mean, we went from she was literally fantasizing about murdering him and trying to figure out ways that she could make sure that she could kill him fast enough that he couldn't kill her with his magic, up to, I mean, the final, conflict scene at the end. I mean, she's, literally he's being pulled into the stone and she's grasping at him trying to pull him out, and they're raising a kid together, and there were what I perceived to be, they were it was a complicated relationship, but it was not.
It wasn't complicated. Cyan just likes to watch, and I think so does Baster.
No, that part wasn't complicated, but I mean the emotional dynamic
Yeah, absolutely.
was. I'll grant that it wasn't as simple as they hated each other at the beginning, and then at the end they had, like, traditional, like Victorian love. But it was pretty fucking close, and I have to admit that I reading the narrative, I you pointed it out, and I was also thinking it was going to go this way, and I can remember listening to it and just going, okay, we've got, a progressive female author. Surely she's not going to do this, but nope.
It doesn't count if you've got a hot uh, native islander third in there.
Oh, okay. So like LGBTQ plus acceptance trumps 1,000-year old played out fucking male centric trope that is one of the very things that feminists have criticized about fantasy literature for decades and decades and decades. It's okay to just still fucking do that as long as you just throw in a token gay character.
It's a polycule and it's two dudes, so that makes it absolutely feminist.
This is irony, right?
Oh yeah,
Okay.
but there are people who don't think it's irony.
Because I will grant that and I'm blanking on the character's name. Who was the third wheel?
Inan,
Was that his name?
I think so.
Okay. Well, in any event, I'll admit that that was interesting, and it made for a more dynamic relationship between the group. But I
The most
mean,
interesting part of the story was the time on the island. I think that's fair to say.
yeah, I would agree with that. But I just couldn't get away from if that part of it wasn't there, this would just be another instance of a female character effectively being raped, and then just having it whitewashed.
Yeah, it definitely felt like a lot of emphasis was put on how shitty Alabaster's position was when 98% of the burden of the situation was being put on Cyan. Like, yeah, Baster has to fuck some women he doesn't want to fuck. That sucks. It really does. Cyan has to carry a baby she doesn't want for 9 fucking months and then have that baby ripped away from her as soon as it's born.
Yeah, there was not parity between the level of, I guess, what you would call victimhood between the two of them. Even though, again, it felt kind of slimy that the
If
narratives seemed to be written in a way to try and present it such that it was like, well, yeah, it's it's forced breeding and it's rape, so on and so forth, but also, like, the guy really wasn't super into it either, so it's okay in the end. And they connected on wanting the baby to have a good life, and so that's the part that you should focus on.
yeah, it's kind of one of those funny things. I know a lot of people think it's silly to play what ifs with fiction. What if I remember playing this when I was reading Game of Thrones at work years ago. What if Littlefinger, or what if Catelyn hadn't met the dwarf? It doesn't matter. What if they hadn't met at the inn? Well, If that doesn't happen, then the entire rest of the plot doesn't happen. So, that's why that happened. But I mean, if you think about it, if they had waited 2 weeks to send them on that mission in the fifth season, there's a good chance she doesn't go. Cyan doesn't go. She's pregnant at that point. She stays at the fulcrum, maybe gets a fifth ring for contributing to the eugenics program, and she carries that child, and it is ripped away from her, and that is the end of her story. If they just wait 2 weeks, but instead she goes on this madcap adventure with Alabaster that ends with them in a an island polycule for what, 2 years, 2.5 years, with
Well,
a
and you know, lest we forget, this isn't the only sort of like dread or ugly trope that is happening here, because the reason that she kind of falls for him is her worship of his power. And there's also this, the character is set up as taking the role of her teacher or her educator, and there's also this weird dynamic where he does something, and it's, throughout the whole text he does something, and then there's quite a bit of page space dedicated to Cyanite just discussing how in awe of his, big origin PP that she is. His Sessa PP.
recipe.
He's got a big Sessapine.
Absolutely.
So I thought it was gross. Again, I think I have an idea of the way that she was trying to construct a more progressive narrative. I just struggle to understand why the method that she used was to include this kind of, I struggle to even think of a more odious trope in fantasy than exactly this type of relationship. And so, I don't think she subverts it. If anything,
Absolutely not.
she sort of reifies that trope, but just adds in a little bit of homosexual flair at the end of it. That wasn't enough for me. Again, it just seemed like it seemed almost pro forced breeding.
Yeah, that's the thing. There's a lot of talk about how awful the fulcrum is, and how heinous what they do to the origins, to the Ragas. I mean, it's got Cyan denying that she's a human being. She doesn't consider Ragas humans. I don't know. I guess I don't feel there's enough done to counteract the things that happen. Like I already mentioned, how it focuses so intently on how bad the situation is for Alabaster, how much he suffers for it, and Cyan is just kind of there, like occasionally getting some pity or whatever, but mostly just there. And there's nothing. She constantly says in her inner monologue how terrible the fulcrum is, and it's clear that the fulcrum is not good. Like there's no endorsement of the fulcrum, but I don't feel there's enough of a condemnation of it's one of those things where you really don't want to show positive things happening as a result of terrible things in fiction, because it makes people think that those terrible things are worth it.
Oh yeah, I can absolutely see a young adult of let's just say of a particular political persuasion reading this novel and being like, okay, the powerful older man gets to fuck the younger attractive chick, and the only part of it that really ends up being bad is that they want to take the baby away. But the underlying power dynamic that exists, I could almost see some readers finding that appealing.
Oh yeah. There's no shortage of this kind of relationship in various amateur fiction places. Not there's even some that's not erotic.
Absolutely. Um, And then I guess to pivot a little bit, the the descriptions of the sex early in the novel are just kind of came off to me as strange because we know that Alabaster is 40, but there's like this the whole like first scene seems to be like a weird like erectile dysfunction thing. And I mean, I don't know. You'll have to tell me if this is, is it me at the tail end of my mid 30s, looking at 40 coming along in 4 years, and having like a pre midlife crisis situation here, or is 40 the age where you would just default to like maybe your dick doesn't work?
Um, I read that as more of a crack at his age, not a literal, "Oh, you're so old your dick doesn't work." Not
Well, I mean, she
literally.
even says like, well, this is a problem when you're with an older man, and then he plays with himself and it's just not working for him, and so she has to get in there with her supple young hands and get things working.
Yeah, I forgot about that part of the scene. Yeah. I mean, that could just be down to, women writing men, but
I don't know, it seemed a little bit weird, and the author would have been in her, I guess, mid 40s at the time that she wrote the book. I think she's like 50-ish now, right? And it came out when, in like 2015 or
2016?
something.
Yeah.
And so I don't know if that was just a little bit of projection, but I just read that as it just seemed, I don't know, I guess like it just seemed like anti-male in like a weird kind of like backhanded way that just kind of didn't match up to. 'Cause I've just never met anybody that was like 40 where the discussion was like, can I even get a boner?
40 is a little on the young side for that kind of, feeling, but it's certainly, I don't know, it's the kind of jokes I could see people making about someone who's 40.
Okay, right. So like, from the eyes of a 20-year-old.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I can buy that. It just seemed it was a very intentional addition to the text. It didn't seem like it was a passing comment that because she keeps drawing our attention to that throughout the text. And so I thought that it at least bore some mention here.
Yeah, I guess I didn't take that for anything other than I guess I had forgotten about the fact that it took her supple young hands to bring his staff to life. I just took it as a crack at old people, either in universe or the author making a deliberate crack.
Yeah, well, and it just, throughout the scenes, it was like, the descriptions, like when he would come, it was this weird, I don't know, it just seemed like she was describing it as though he was like 65 or 70, like he could just barely get the job done, and the whole thing was a chore, so to speak, in that regard. But then, I mean, what the he was 10 years older than her, 15 years, because what, she was in her 20s.
Yeah,
Again, it just didn't seem true to. I know lots of people in their mid 20s that end up with somebody that's in their late 30s or early 40s, and I've just never. I didn't realize that that was a thing that was so common as to be the go to jab, as it were, in a narrative.
yeah. I mean, there's definitely a bit of a trope about the 20-year-old girl with the 40, 50-year-old guy. I don't generally the trope with that is that the men are predatory at best, but
Right, but as we said, there's some weird stuff going on in the narrative where she seems to try and position Alabaster as not being a predator.
no, she tries to make him out as, if anything, a bigger victim of the system than Cyan, which I would definitely agree that he is a victim. I don't think he's a bigger victim than any woman who is forced to bear even one child for someone who's just more powerful.
Yeah, I would have preferred if the entire trope had not been of sort of like foreground for the narrative, but if it was going to be in there, the way that it was presented, again, like I've said with several of the topics we've discussed today, I did get the impression that there was some kind of an argument being made by the text, but it just seemed convoluted and left me feeling like nothing concrete was being implied. And if anything, that there was a weirdly neutral or even slightly positive view being taken on these things.
Yeah, when I learned from you that this was a an academically lauded book, I was frankly shocked, because any message it has is extremely muddled, and if I didn't know that apparently there is a message in this book, I would assume it was just a bit of slightly naughty thriller, or fantasy material, with maybe some sketchy plots of involving eugenics and forced schooling and relocation. Like there's no clear racial allegory. I mean, I guess we're kind of blending into the race and stuff, but I figured we would with identity. Like you could argue that the ragas are sort of a stand-in for insert minority here. It's a little weird to make your minority, your persecuted minority allegory, be the people with apocalyptic powers.
Yeah. Well, a lot of what I'm seeing is people praising the novel for its exploration of sexuality. And so I have not taken the time to, go to the EBSCO host and the MLA database and start reading articles from journals, but a cursory glance at stuff, it almost seems like academics are not at all focusing on the initial relationship, the sexual relationship between Alabaster and Cyanite, and are instead choosing to focus more on the fact that the novel includes a relationship between the three of them. So it's, I guess, Asun or Cyanite and was it Inan? Was that the guy?
I think that's his name, Inan.
It seems like, as you pointed out, once the three of them are together, the relationship between Essun and Alabaster is no longer a sexual relationship. The sex is happening between Alabaster and Inan and Cyanite. And so I guess the justification is that once they are quote unquote free of the prescribed breeding that is happening at the beginning, that they no longer choose to have a sexual relationship. And so
Okay,
therefore,
so if this is some bold exploration of sexuality, then the academics really need to get laid because there is nothing bold about the sexualities of anyone described here in these books. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. We've got a straight woman who likes to watch two dudes having sex. Newsflash, that is every woman. That is every woman. You've got a dude who likes to fuck men and women and is just kind of generally a charismatic, gregarious guy. That's really common. That's a really common dude. I know a lot of dudes like that. And then you've got the bottom twink who is okay with women but mostly likes dudes, but really likes to watch women getting fucked. None of these are especially kinky or exotic, unless your knowledge of sex ended in approximately the 1850s.
Well, I mean, in the realm of fantasy, that is sort of what happens. A lot of times, the you are sort of talking about a medievalized Eurocentric situation where most of the time you have like a one white male main character and a some princess or some equivalent to that having
So
a
is it really so easily to get lauded for for bold bold narratives in sexuality by having two gay dudes who are also basically both bi?
um yes, well, clearly
Okay. Um
that's where we're at. Yeah.
I am announcing my new novel out next year. It will include two women and two dudes who are all fucking each other. Apparently, it will completely revolutionize it will completely blow the minds of every fantasy academic.
Yeah, I mean, I can off the top of my head there is some, I think at least one pair, but maybe a couple of lesbians in the Sword of Truth series.
So
But
I can recognize that this may be an underrepresented section of fantasy. Like I could recognize that there are not a lot of queer relationships in fantasy, because exactly like you said, it is typically this very medieval European attitude towards sex and relationships. But I don't know that. I guess we do want to praise authors who take steps towards broadening that horizon.
yeah, I
Um,
have no problem being happy with praising, valorizing whatever Jameson's inclusion of queer elements in the sexuality of her characters. The problem for me is that that is sort of a bookend to an otherwise problematic reifying of tropes from the genre that are much more insidious. Again, it very much feels like she just did what I would expect any backward thinking white author of, you know, sexually regressive fantasy would do. But then at the end, she's like, well, I'll throw in. It just seemed very token to me. And it sort of comes into the book later on, and it didn't resolve for me the problematic nature of Alabaster and Essun's sexual dynamic in a way that I thought was satisfactory.
so if we continue the lens of analysis that we mentioned earlier about this could potentially be read as a someone who was well versed in anarcho-syndicalist. I almost called it lore, but there are several
Hey,
people on
I'm
the
I'm
internet
down with
who would
that.
murder me. Anarcho-syndicalist theory, who is deliberately painting a bad picture of anarcho-syndicalism. If we extend that into something a little more sinister, the idea of degeneracy causing downfall. This is something that is sort of implied in universe. Cyanide certainly believes that her happiness causes the downfall, or something. That seems to be implied with regards to the destruction of the island and the death of Corundum and Inna.
Can I break in?
Absolutely.
So for me, the weakest part of the novel is when they're on the island and it's made very clear that they're essentially they have found their paradise. and it has to be kept secret, and they survive by being pirates. And then Essun is just like, hey, just take me so I can see this fucking city that I'd like to see. And then of course they get fucking busted. I absolutely hated that. It just
I
made
mean,
it made the character seem stupid, and why nobody would fucking do that. You have a kid, and you finally found a place where you might be safe as long as it's kept secret, and so you and they set it up where they're telling her like, we don't want to take you on this pirate mission and you need to follow orders, and then the character just goes full stupid and
and
bring
it's paradoxical because the whole book is like this peon to motherhood and the instincts of a mother and the the nature of a mother. And I don't know too many new mothers who would want to spend a week or more away from their 2-year old. Like, I could call my sister right now. Well, not right now. She's probably asleep. But I could call my sister and ask her, so your son's like 4 now. How would you feel about voluntarily going on a dangerous expedition that would keep you away from him for a week or two?
well,
Um,
and she does like a full murder and sinks all those ships and kills all those people to keep them secret, and then immediately just all right, now just drive me to where anybody could see us, please.
yeah,
It was
it,
so bad, dude. Like
it's
F
especially
triple minus.
it's especially egregious because the the implication is that the guardians can sort of track them anywhere. I mean, if their guardians can track them anywhere, then they have to be able to know. We've been flirting with the magic system for a while now,
Yeah,
so I
this
think we'll
this
have
is as
to.
good of a transition as we're gonna get. Hit me up.
It's stupid and it makes no sense and is entirely plot driven because it does what is necessary for the plot. Somehow, the ability to sense and control seismic activity gives you fucking superpowers. Doesn't Alabaster literally use orogeny to like cleanse his fucking blood?
Yep.
Yeah. So, and apparently this is all from a magic organ, the Cesapine.
Sesapiner.
Yeah. Uh, that apparently everyone has, but Ragas have a better one, a mutated one, a different one.
Big Sesapimpi.
Yeah. I don't know. It's and apparently so we discussed this before the show, and neither of us are entirely clear, I think, even though you've read a bit more than I have now. Uh apparently the Guardians are like modified origins.
I mean, it seems like they can they can deaden orogeny in a radius around them. It seems like they can interact with other people's orogeny in a variety of ways. They can physically touch an origin and kill them with their own sesapiner. And again, I'm not sure if this spoils a little bit into the second book or not. I can't remember, but it seems like they also feed off of people's orogeny, and it kills them. And all cards on the table. There is no magic system that I can think of that I despise more than inborn magic, where it seems pretty random how powerful a given person is, but also with a binary that there is a class of people who are anti magic and can just turn it off. There's nothing lamer. It is my most reviled and hated application of magic in fantasy, and this is the worst magic system I think I have ever encountered.
Well said. It's it. This is the second time we've encountered a magic system that cries out to be a part of a tabletop game, or a video game, because it just does what is necessary for the plot. You either need to have something necessary to put rules on it, or you need to be in a place where you use it in specific ways, because otherwise, I mean, apparently babies can prevent earthquakes in a miles radius. What happens when you have a colicky baby? Like, we discussed this earlier, like a week or so ago. There's no ways humanity would survive the existence of origins,
Oh
because
no, no, that's crazy.
the first time a baby gets a wet diaper and it takes 7 seconds too long to change it, which will be the first time it gets a wet diaper for anyone who's ever had a child, the world is over. They are causing apocalyptic events in at least a localized area, and that will happen everywhere there are children. I mean, yes, concentrating them, training them like they do makes sense. That's one of the reasons why I don't understand how, if this is what is the actual struggle here, because the people you've put up as your like underclass are fucking demigods. I mean, Cyan literally destroys a town because someone shot a crossbow bolt at her, and the bolt didn't even come close to hitting her.
Yeah, and I mean, when you devise a system like this that is so crazy, I think it necessitates a cheesy counterpart like the Guardians in order to rein it in. And the result of that is just this I don't know. There's no I just don't care. The every revelation that we get about the things that can be done with orogeny is made less cool by the existence of the Guardians, who for every new thing we learn about orogeny, we learn about a new way that the Guardians can just turn them off.
It's not only that, but it's a magic it's a fireball magic. That's all it can do. It can throw fireballs. And that magic is cool, but it creates cool scenes. It doesn't build cool stories. If that's all your magic can do, but it's still a central focal point of the story, then it kind of limits the kind of stories you can tell. So I think that's a big problem, is that if your protagonists are origins, ragas, they're reclaiming it, you want to create situations where they can use their special power. You gave them the power for a reason. Well, those aren't really scenes of like talking or uh discussion. Those are going to be action scenes. So you need to put them in a situation where they can pull a fucking stone spike up into a ship. It's the kind of magic system that lends itself to a video game, not a book.
Well, and it's kind of like if you take one of those magic systems where, you know, you have mages that have the five colors of robes, there's earth, water, wind,
Yeah,
fire,
these are the
earth,
Earth mages.
and that's all there is the lamest of the schools of magic is earth magic, and that's all they got.
So I think it would be interesting to compare this to the Witcher series, which I have not read the books and I've only played the third game. So I've been engaged with almost none of the actual like official Witcher uh, properties. But I have watched a lot of stuff about The Witcher and played the game extensively. And I understand that the magic in the game is likely an adaptation of whatever magic was in the books, but the books are about an adventurer fighting monsters. So you would expect him to have mostly fireball type spells, right? Well, no. He explicitly has a mind control spell. He has a charm spell. He has a spell that can just like light a candle. Like he has spells that are not big flashy combat spells in a game that is explicitly like an adventure combat game. The idea that that is what The Witcher would have, and this book has a magic system that is basically just earthquake. That's all it does. It just casts earthquake. It's just earthquake on mouse one, just doing that over and over again. That's the magic system.
Yeah, I mean, there's, as you brought up, there are instances where, for example, Alabaster cleanses his blood of a toxin, and so we're teased with that maybe there are some non-flash combat elements to the sorcery that could be learned. As far as the system itself, I could not enjoy it because there seemed to be no, as you said, babies can do it, and then there are some people who are trained, but there are just random mages that are running around, and there is this kind of weird interplay between origins that were trained at the fulcrum versus ones that were not, and evidently like the thing that you learn is not how to increase your power, so to speak, but how to gain fine control over it. So there she does take a lot of time to explore the system, but the foundation of it is just not cool. And I'm trying to think, even if there were no guardians, if there wasn't just this on off switch uh, in the novel, would I enjoy the magic system? And I still don't think so.
So I'm going to disagree that the base of it is uncool. I think the idea of a magic system where the base of it is uh summoning energy from the earth and that potentially having a deleterious effect on the area. I think that's a cool basis for a magic system. Doing other stuff with the magic, like you summon this power and you can use it to do a charm spell or an illusion, or throw a fireball, or make a rock spike or earthquake or whatever. Um, but the more energy you use, the more effects it has. Like a fireball might not cause anything, but if you need to like if you blanket an area in fire, you could cause a massive earthquake. And like massive expenditures of magic could cause massive you know volcanic eruptions or something. Um,
No, that part isolated, I think that part is fine. And in fact,
right.
that's pretty consistent with like magic systems that I would myself use. But as a package, and when you combine it with that it's
That magic system is copyrighted. Staff and Trenchcoat Inc. LLC. All rights reserved. Don't steal it.
yeah, all rights reserved. Uh, but as a full package, the system is I don't know. Again, it's hard for me to come up with ways to articulate my criticism of it without just like attacking the skill of the author, which I don't think is necessarily warranted. It seems like the narrative that she wanted to tell was constructed before the system, and then as the story went along and she was writing it, she had to keep coming up with limiters to introduce. And for me, that made the system. I again, there was no sense of wonder. I was just waiting for the next revelation of how they can do some magnificent thing. But of course, if a guardian just walks by, then you're just nullified.
Yeah. I pretty much cottoned on right away that this is a fireball and earthquake magic system. So the only cool things they're going to be doing is throwing fireballs and making the earth shake.
Does anybody throw a fireball?
No, no,
Yeah,
throwing
because I
fireballs
I'm
just
I'm a sucker for fireballs, so that would have helped. Like if they did some shit like that. But as far as I could tell, it was basically just I make it cold, or I shake Earth now.
yeah. No, no one throws a fireball that I saw. No one. It's pretty much just make the earth shake, make a torus, and bring spikes of earth up out of the ground, spikes of rock.
And again, the main thing for me is that magical power is a function of random birth. It doesn't seem like training makes you a more powerful origin. It just makes you a more precise origin. Hence the breeding aspect of it. And those types of systems just don't vibe with me. And again, there might be hordes and hordes of readers who absolutely love that type of thing, but it just smacks to me of the this character is the chosen one, and so on and so forth. They have the highest midichlorian count.
The
If
implication
only they
I
would be trained by the Jedi Order.
Yeah, it was weird to me. Maybe I missed something, but it seemed like they were implying that Alabaster was like uniquely powerful, and that there was no such thing as a ten ringer before him. Um,
It's explicit that he's the most powerful living origin,
okay,
and that's why they want to breed him, is in the hopes that his offspring will also have gigantic sesapipes.
right. So it's unclear whether Cyan, it's unclear to me whether Cyan also has a an above average Sessapepe or a massive bitch breaker Sessapepe, excuse me. Because I remember Alabaster does say that you'll start to sense it around your seventh or eighth ring, implying that he felt she had the capacity to get to that level. But
Yeah,
it
but it's not like you go to the fulcrum and they teach you how to do magic. You go to the fulcrum and they torture you, and you learn fine control, and then you begin to understand the intricacies of the power that you already possess.
true.
And I just prefer magic systems that are meritocracy based.
Yeah, especially since, and I think I mentioned this before on the show. I subscribe to Jordan's theorem that any hereditary based magic cast will inevitably control that society.
Yeah, with the caveat that unless you create like a hyper ham fisted super anti mage class that have complete and total ability to negate the powers of that magic class.
Why do you think they keep the Ragas so controlled? The leadership class control the Ragas, so they are an implicit threat. The Guardians are the ways they control the Ragas.
Yeah, yeah, yep, that is
That's what I
indeed.
mean. To make explicit what I'm implying, in the Wheel of Time, there are basically three different kinds of magic user societies. Actually, four. There's the Aes Sedai, who are essentially spiders. They have a giant web they've woven among the royal houses of Randland, and from there they exert a an oversized amount of control for their size, on politics. It's not complete control, but it's a good amount of control. The second example is the Shanchan, who literally leash their magic users and use them as weapons of war. So the person with the most leashed magic users is the ruler. Uh, the Empress literally has the most uh, demonic. The third is the Sharans, who we don't actually see a direct example of, but we have examples in ancillary literature, who are uh, basically their society is set up with a puppet leader who happens to die every 7 years. And the behind the scenes reality is that there is a cast of channelers who uh, breed with slave channelers in order to create more powerful members to reinforce their power. And it's this big secret society. Anyway, the channelers control that society in secret. The fourth is the sea folk, who have a very strict hierarchy uh, that is actually it's strictly fluid. It's complicated and not worth going into. But the point of it is that in that society, channeling doesn't mean anything. There is a rank on the ships for channelers, but it doesn't. There's no way to gain disproportionate power as a channeler in that society. So they are, of course, the most balanced and most positive society. So that is what they have done here. In to bring it back to the fifth season is they have corralled and controlled the magic users so that they can keep the government has explicitly created this program so that it keeps the rest of the society pacified.
Right. Well, I would class the magic system in the Wheel of Time as also not being to my taste because
Oh
again,
no,
it
it's
is a
hereditary.
yeah, it's this hereditary, and I don't know. I guess the to aside from just my taste, it's the difference between. Um, I'll give an example of a system that I really liked, which was the Animorphs, which was where you had these kids and they they sort of happen upon knowledge. And yes, there is the you need the cube and so on and so forth, but as the stories progress, they learn how to become better, for lack of a better term in this case, let's just say mages. But it
Would you
couldn't
say that a good rule of thumb is that the acquisition of power must not come from some unique source? Because the cube
no,
is
I
unique to
for me the main thing is that it could have been any kids.
right.
It didn't have to just be this one character devised by the author for the purpose of filling a specific power level in their narrative. It it's something that anyone could be given or learn or explore. And in a story like the fifth season, you get the very strong impression that you are following the chosen one. And for me, again, that is a holdover of sort of like Judeo Christian mythological underpinnings where there has to be this inexplicably overpowered hereditary version of the magic system in your world that rises up and does all of the things that no one else could do because no one else was born to it in the same way that Jesus Christ was. Excuse me, that the Raga in the story was the Essun or Cyanite.
I mean, they all but make her messianic status explicit with the way that Tonki was following her for 30 years and the way that Hoa was following her and the way he talked about her in the end of that one chapter. It just
Yeah, she's literally the chosen one.
yeah, and apparently she and Alabaster alone have had experience with the obelisks and have tried to control them. And I guess Alabaster wants to go to the moon.
As the the trench coat, the sci-fi half of this partnership was that like a Oh, sweet, cool sci-fi reveal. All right, where were you at with that?
I was a flat what? I just you got to be shitting me.
Yeah, because I mean, it read to me like a super wet fart at the end, right?
It felt like they were going. She was going for this big reveal. It's like, oh, oh, bet she didn't see this coming. It's the moon. How did he phrase it? Have you ever heard of the moon?
No, that was exactly it. He was like, have you ever heard of a moon?
I guess it was the perfect ending because it made me like, well, I am definitely curious about where this goes, but definitely not in a I want to find out what happens by reading the books. In a I'm going to go to a wiki and have it tell me what happens.
Oh yeah, I'm sure there's a fairly detailed synopsis readily available. Yeah, I just didn't. I guess I read that part or listened to that part, and I was wondering like, who is this for? I mean, I guess at the same time, was that sort of the overt reveal that the setting for the novel is Earth?
If that was your if that was supposed to be the reveal, I mean, it was obvious.
I agree. I thought I thought it was a kind of obvious novel in general, but I guess like that was the first explicit reveal in that sense, right?
I mean, I did mention earlier that I do think there is something interesting in the existence of mists, and that because that I think a more interesting author might have done something interesting with like language evolution, and how that is represented, but in this case, it just kind of felt like it was just being clever, not like there was actually anything being said.
So while we're on that note, let's have our quick, standard staff and trench coat discussion of what was your take on the use of invented curses and also the presence of words like fuck and shit and so on and so forth.
So I'm usually a defender of this because I think it helps to build the world. It helps with world building. And I stand by that statement. That said, it felt a little overdone, especially I don't know, it's interesting to have so essentially their word for the intensifier use of fucking is rusting. You rusting bastard, I'll rusting do what I rusting well please. Which is interesting because they also have the idea of fuck as in to copulate. You generally don't see that, so it is interesting to see it here. But I don't know, it did feel a little off in a way. I liked it and then I didn't. I think it was too much.
I almost thought for a little while that the mixture of the two would make it come off less cheesy to me, but being able to, in the same chapter, even have the juxtaposition of, I guess, what we'll just call standard recognizable curse words and then invented, it made it so much worse for me. It was really grating, and they use the or rather the author uses the rusting convention way too frivolously. However, I did like the use of like the phrase evil earth.
Yeah.
I liked that one. And I thought that if she had just had regular curse words and then this new one that had emerged, Evil Earth, that I think could have actually been dope. But the rusting thing was hyper cringe. It I just couldn't stand it. And then there was this moment at the end of the book where the Guardian, I can't remember his name, some name that ends in an A,
Rafa?
was that his name?
Maybe.
Rafa or Asha or something like that. And he's gonna take her baby or whatever, and so her response to him is she says, you can't do this or whatever, you such and such, you fucker. and it again, it was like a
Doesn't
super.
she say, "You rusting fucker"?
I don't think it went that far. But I remember hearing the line, and I literally was sat here at my desk, and I went, "Oh no," uh, because the way that it was phrased made it come off as so cheesy and anticlimactic. It was again just kind of a wet fart. But no, I don't think the phrase "rusting fucker" ever actually appears.
Rusting bastard definitely does.
Yeah, and I get it, right? It's the post-apocalyptic thing. The acid rain comes, it rusts the metal, so they don't use much metal anymore. Rust is bad, so it becomes a curse word. I get it. Okay, fine. It just, but there's not any rust in the story. No, there's no physical rust that gets described, and so
No, in fact, the one time they encounter metal, it is unrusted because it's been underground and cared for.
yeah, so it just it wasn't for me. I think the narrative would have flowed better if she would have just picked. I hate to say it, but if she had just gone full in on the evil earth and rusting and not had the regular words, or just not had the evil earth and rusting and just used regular curse words, I think both of those would have been a better choice than mixing the two. And so for me, at least, that was educational in the sense that I have not read a novel that did it this way. And I could have seen myself trying to execute this in my own writing, and I absolutely won't now. I'll just pick one or the other. But again, Evil Earth was dope, and I also really enjoyed the way it came up a couple times where in the Stone lore, the narrator would go full gravitas, and it was, first guard the gate. I liked that phrase.
Yeah.
Hit me up on gender.
I definitely think there was something, certainly with the breeder. I believe that was a use cast as breeder.
Oh, was it really? Yeah, I
It,
guess. Was that an actual use cast, or was that just like a phrase that they used to denote people who had the correct, body figure a la the standards of the narrative world?
I don't know. It's a little hard to say. I guess it isn't a use cast because one of the problems with Tonki was that she was transgender, so she couldn't be a breeder. But she couldn't be a breeder if she was,
Nope. So I've got it here from the wiki fandom thing is called the Eighth University,
of
and
course.
yeah, which I thought. I mean, that's fun, because right wasn't the Seventh University the most prominent one in the story?
Yes.
Yeah. So okay, fine. That's clever. It's breeders, guardian, innovator, leadership, resistant, and strong back, and then there's a bullet for unknown. So I guess
So
we
there
we
was
only know 6 of the 7 accepted, and then there are less common ones: origin, lorist, geomist, Geneer, archaeomest, biomest, metal metallurist, astronomist, and hunter. So my guess is with a lot of these secondary ones, they don't even have their own pages in the wiki, so maybe they just get mentioned briefly here and there in maybe the second and third books.
that could be, or they mentioned so and so is a blah 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 use cast, but don't elaborate on that.
Right. And it just says breeders are the cast assigned to keep a comms numbers stable. So,
You don't say.
and I
Eh,
guess I guess it says the strongbacks are just a laborer cast. So I thought they were also functioning as like the militia.
It's not. It's pretty clearly stated that
Oh no, I guess they're just laborers and they get thrown out if there's a season.
sure, why not? You definitely don't need strong workers when. I mean, I guess I get it.
Well, right, as commentary on as as our real world plunges into ecological collapse, it is likely that the working class, as it were, the strongback class, will be the ones that will bear the most of the hardship.
Yeah, there's certainly a commentary there. I don't know, I guess I feel like that's mostly because we've sort of that is social commentary, it certainly works as social commentary, but we haven't really that doesn't work in that society because there's no way that the strong, fit, able-bodied people would be the least desirable people to have in the kind of survival situation they're talking about.
I will say, I think a narrative in this world, roughly, where there was a more pointed exploration of the comm system, and instead of these Christ like characters that we follow, it was just some regular people, and, sort of like their struggle to survive a season, and then maybe like some middling power level origins that are not the fulcrum ones, and how they, try and use their powers to help and not get discovered, so on and so forth. That I think could be a really cool story, because like there's so much that could be, so much social commentary that could be done with, who gets thrown out, and uh, the descriptions of the, people starving, and they're trying to figure things out, get food, and have clean water, and all of that stuff. And I guess that's another thing that's been on my mind, is that the setting for the novel seems so ripe for being able to create scenarios that make really interesting social commentary, but she just doesn't do that. Instead, we follow these, again, Christ like characters, and most of the things that I anticipated that the novel was going to comment on very strongly, it kind of goes the opposite direction. It's just a very weird book.
Yeah, weird is the word for sure.
But I think we derailed ourselves because we were gonna jump into gender.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know that it's fair to say the book doesn't have anything doesn't have much to say about gender, but I don't think it's saying it very loud. I don't know. I mean, there's definitely a lot of emphasis on women and motherhood. A lot of emphasis on women and motherhood.
Well, and do you think that's a good thing?
No.
Because again, I guess I'm, as a, granted I'm disabled, but other than that, I'm a pretty, typical, you know, middle class white dude who wants to write fantasy. And if I try and imagine like what pitfalls might I go into that would get me criticized, trying to approach the writing of fantasy from the perspective of, I want to tell stories that are similar to the ones I enjoyed as a child, but everybody wants to write a better story. Obviously, whether they succeed or not is one thing, but I want to write them in a way that doesn't, reify these shitty stereotypes. And I feel like if I wrote a novel where the big focus of all the female characters in the novel is their relationship to the children that they bear, I feel like that would be a thing that I would be criticized for, or I guess I would fear that I would be criticized for. And so, is this a situation, do you think, where because it's a woman who has written the novel, that in fact it's not a thing to be criticized, and in fact it should be valorized as a fantasy novel that focuses on this real, facet of the female experience? Or is this sort of a, again, if you didn't know who wrote the book, would you, do you imagine that readers might just come away from this thinking, all right, so it's women make babies and are mothers, and that's their predominant feature?
Yeah, that's kind of the I feel like that there's a certain amount of the vengeful Mother Earth. Like that's what she's trying to go for in Cyanide. It doesn't work. I do think there's a lot of emphasis put on motherhood as a female trait. Maybe this was me reading into it, but it felt like there was a sort of implication of that Baster was a little more effeminate, especially once they got to the island. I don't know. Again, I'm probably reading into it,
No,
presumed
I had the
assumptions.
same impression.
Okay.
I mean, I don't know if that like solves it, like it's just two of us, but like I kind of felt the same way, especially since the other male that gets introduced to their relationship seems to be much more archetypically masculine.
Yeah, and what I was concerned about my interpretation was because he was the submissive gay male partner. I guess it's just that he's given all the traits of a female in our society and in his own.
That's fair. I guess what I'm it seems like a lot of the novel is focused on the main character just kind of chasing kids around or just like dealing with the realities of having kids. And that seems to be to me the core feature of the novel. And I guess I maybe it would just I guess it would be nice if we had a I don't know a gender studies major or something that could come in and direct us a little bit here. But I'm it seems like to me that it isn't the thing that people don't like is that when female characters get reduced to just being mothers and baby creators at the expense of the exploration of their other talents.
Yeah, that's generally frowned on in like progressive spaces. I don't.
One, do you think that this novel does that, or
It certainly so it definitely lionizes motherhood. Especially I think with the way Esun behaves, but especially I mean the implication with the Father Earth, Mother Earth. We were fine until Mother left. That's a pretty strong endorsement of motherhood, I think.
yeah? And I mean, I don't have any problem. I think it's fine to, as you said, lionize motherhood. It just seemed. I mean, all right. So we have
It's
the
hard to say whether it is. It's hard to say whether it is making any statements about women in general or just this one woman. The assumption is usually that in stories like this that you're making that the statements are being made for women, not this one woman, as far as I understand it, right?
well, right. I mean, we don't want to try and universalize too much, but I mean, we sort of have to go based on what the text gives us.
Right.
And all the moments that I can think of where Esun sort of uses her power, the for example, there's the scene where the person shoots the crossbow at her, and then she's just gonna destroy this whole town and kill tons of innocent people. But it is her impetus towards motherhood that stops her. She sees the little kid running out of the building, and remembers like, oh, kids. I've you know, has she had kids by that stage? Yes. Uh, oh, I've had those, uh, and that's what returns her to some semblance of having a moral compass. And then just much of what she does throughout the novel is really focused on having children and raising children. And again, I'm left wondering, does this make a progressive statement about the ways that we can depict female characters in fantasy, or does it just kind of reify the stereotype, albeit with a more prominent position in the story?
I definitely don't think it does anything positive for the concept of women in motherhood roles. Like I don't think it does that positively. Well, no, it doesn't do it negatively. But I don't think it does anything like cool or special.
So are we kind of circling around the general like is our some summary criticism, N.K. Jemisin the fence sitter?
That seems to be the case. I mean, apparently you can get accolades for displaying a relationship that would barely merit a teen rating on AO3 in fantasy these days. So, I guess the bar isn't too high.
Well, and there's not any queer relationships that take place in the novel that don't include like an element of more, you know, heteronormative type elements, right? There's not two men who have a sex scene up by themselves or two women, right?
No, not that I recall. I imagine we would recall something like that.
Do you think that the inclusion of that would have made the novel stronger?
It depends on the context.
Well,
I
of
can
course.
I can certainly imagine a situation where it would make it weaker. But it definitely could have. It definitely would have gone a long way towards making it a more genuinely diverse. Because ultimately, this is the kind of relationship that wouldn't be out of place in like a racier middle-aged woman romance novel. Obviously,
I can't comment on that. What I will say is, I I have never read a fantasy novel that had anything approaching the type of sexual scenes that occur between Essun Alabaster and whatever his name was.
Inan.
Innan.
I don't know why his name stuck with me. None of the other names did.
Well, no, as I think I said this before we started recording, but you have Demaya, and you have Jija, and Hoa, and
Shasha,
Shasha, and Alia.
Yika. I think that's the name of the leader at the place at the end.
Yeah, so lots of names that have very similar sounds to them. Yeah, I guess in summary, as far as the gender stuff goes, I guess maybe we're being a little bit overcritical of the novel, given the acclaim that it's received and the academic critical attention. But this is another area where I don't know that I really felt like the novel was doing a whole lot of work towards being quote unquote progressive on the issue of gender.
No. It kind of felt like there was the maybe it was just the scene with Tonki. It felt like that was almost like a sop to progressivism because it was like, yeah, see, she doesn't even care that Tonki is one of the transes. But it came off to me like a, well, it's her life, whatever mistakes she wants to make, she can.
Yeah, and it just seemed I've said it a couple times, but it seemed verging on like tokenism.
Yeah.
Was Tonki's trans? Was that element of her character? Was that the reason that she was ostracized?
So if I remember correctly, it's basically stated that she was uh people weren't happy that she was trying to go to the university, and then when she basically was like, "Oh, also I'm a woman, not a man." She she scuppered a bunch of arranged marriages, presumably because they were two women be who were to be bred, and I guess they were going to respect her decision. I don't know. It's weirdly like not the way the kind of authoritarian families that would exist in this kind of society would operate. Like they would take Tonki and they would shove her in a room and they would say, "Listen, your role here is to be the heir and to provide an heir on whichever woman happens to be lucky enough to marry you. All right? So you're going to do that. And enough of this foolishness about wearing dresses. No, no, you're our heir." Like, that's what would happen in that situation. There's no world in which they would just quietly shuffle him off to a university and quietly disown him. It just,
It did seem a little bit soft in a world where if anything bad happens, they just take huge swaths of their community that they've been living with for years and years and years and just throw them out into death.
you know what it felt like? It felt like the backstory of a D&D character for someone who wants their character to have like wealthy and powerful family, but also for them to be an outcast. So they come up with some bullshit, stupid reason why they would get outcast from their family, but quietly so they can still, maintain ties, even, unofficially. And it just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've basically said what needs to be said on that. It seemed, I don't know, both the sexual stuff and the Tonki stuff seemed inserted in a way that did not feel natural to me as a reader. Because I mean, I would happily enjoy such dynamics and such characters. It just didn't seem like the narrative was constructed in a way that it made a whole lot of sense.
Well, and Tonki being trans, it just adds another layer of ridiculous onto the story. I mean, if she wanted to have Tonki be from a wealthy family but disowned, you know, make it because she decided because she, who was born a she, pick a struggle. Either she was born a she and decided she wanted to be an innovator and would abandon her family to do that, or she was born a he and transitioned, and that caused a rift with the family. Pick a struggle.
Right, because Tonki was born as a sex male, and she
Correct.
was using medication to allow herself to, what would be the correct term, to pass as female.
I don't recall any explicit discussion of medication, but it's possible I missed that.
I thought there was straight up like she started to run out of her meds or something, and so the narrator mentioned that she was starting to smell.
Oh yeah, yeah. There was a mention of that she was running out of that and she'd started to grow stubble or something. Yeah,
Which I don't know. I don't know enough about trans issues to know how that would function.
yeah.
I.e., like I don't know if there's medications that you take in perpetuity that if you stop taking them, you just go back to growing stubble or what. I don't know anything about that. But yeah, again, it I guess it's great that she included more, diverse sexuality and identities in the narrative. But I also think it's fair to ask the question, did those things serve the narrative? And were they introduced and executed in a way that made the underlying message of the novel stronger or weaker? I guess I would give the novel like a B minus on that scale. Like it just didn't seem to enhance things a great deal, but it also read a little bit to me on verging on tokenism. And so I guess that's sort of like where I'll leave that. And I guess like I'm glad that she attempted to be progressive with the novel, but I don't know how successful that was.
Yeah, it's strong drill tweet energy of turning the dial on progressivism and seeing how my audience reacts.
Yeah, I basically agree with that. I'm just kind of looking at our list here, and I think we've pretty well covered the gender and the family relationship stuff, and I think we've said a fair amount about the post apocalyptic setting of the novel. And I mean, do we want to talk explicitly about the reception of the novel as our sort of last major topic?
I mean, we've alluded to it. Maybe we should make explicit that apparently this book has received has it received I know it received the Hugo for I believe best novel. Did it receive explicit awards or is it just like articles?
So it won the Hugo for best novel, and that is the only major award that I see listed just on the Wikipedia page. It is worth noting that the first of or pardon me, all three of the books won that award consecutively, which has never been done before.
Oh,
And in my process of doing research and whatever for grad school applications, one of the things I've been doing is looking at people who are teaching courses on fantasy, and this book appears in every single one of them that I have seen, and it appears in most classes that are being taught with like a sci-fi and fantasy bent, and also many courses that I looked at where the focus was on eco-fiction, and it there are a lot of articles that are being written about it. I know it's being made into a TV show, I believe. So a huge amount of notice and accolades and critical response for the novel, and I feel like that was sort of the intention. It does read to me like a novel that was written at college professors and college students and writers of literary critique.
It's Hugo bait.
Yeah, I suppose Hugo
I mean,
bait.
we have Oscar bait movies. This is a Hugo bait book.
I mean, I guess that's fair. I mean, and if that's the case, then clearly she fucking figured out how to do that. She did it 3 times in a row. Again, like it's not to take anything away from the author. The book is well written. I think generally speaking, it probably deserves the acclaim that has received. I just don't fully understand why, in the sense that unless it is just as simple as that the fantasy genre is seen as so deplorable that the mere inclusion of these elements makes it rise to the absolute pinnacle. And in that case, then yeah, I completely understand, I guess. But I'm not 100% sure that I fully understand why it has been praised, specifically in the ways that it has been praised.
Yeah, my verdict on this is that it is a well-written book, technically speaking, from a technical perspective. But I think there's some perhaps ideological mismatch between myself and the author that prevents me from enjoying or perhaps understanding the book.
Yeah, or like the quote, and again, this is just on Wikipedia, but the an NPR quote. It says Jemisin brilliantly illustrates the belief that yes, imaginative world building is a vital element of fantasy, but also that every character is a world unto herself. And again, okay, fine, uh, that's great, but also super vague.
Yeah, that's incredibly vague.
Yeah, and I guess I feel underqualified to like go on a limb and just say I don't think this book is as good as scholars seem to think that it is. That is the inkling that I get. It is a technically well written book. The prose are solid. It it is definitely a fantasy narrative. It does include progressive elements that are good to see, but for me, as I peel back the surface and begin to examine those elements that I see the book being praised for, I'm having difficulty finding the bedrock of a philosophical trajectory for the novel. And as we've discussed throughout this episode, a lot of the elements that to me at first blush appear to be progressive actually seem to be either neutral or slightly reifying of some tendencies that I have often heard fantasy being criticized for. And so more research is required.
Yeah, so I mean, this wasn't a dumpster fire of a pick like Knight Errant, nor was it a boring slog like Way of Kings. So, um, I mean, you're improving your average here with this pick.
I'm rising up.
Uh, Trend line rising, absolutely. Magdalene rising.
All right, well, I mean, you've kind of given it away, but in conclusion, is it better than Knight Errant?
Yes, it is not quite as obvious fascist propaganda. I mean, you can certainly. I mean, I kind of alluded to the fascist reading of this. that degeneracy begets calamity. But yeah, it is a certainly the characters are much more interesting. Um, I mean that's a low bar compared to Knight Errant, but yeah, it's certainly better. Better pick than that.
All right, well, we'll leave it at that. That is our discussion of the fifth season. And next time, we will be going over Magic Bites by Kate, or no, not by Kate Daniels. Rather, it is the first book in the Kate Daniels series. And that is by Microsoft Word is betraying me here. Is it Ilana Andrews?
I believe so. One second. Actually, it'll be faster. I will look it up on my phone where I have it downloaded if I can find my phone. So yeah, obviously this is my pick, it's my choice. This is a urban fantasy. It takes place in a sort of I call it a post apocalypse. And yes, Ilona Andrews. So yeah, I think we'll all enjoy that. And we'll see next week next time we convene whether I'm right or not.
All right, so yeah, next time it'll be Magic Bites, Kate Daniels, Book One by Ilona Andrews, I believe is the pronunciation. And so we look forward to seeing you then, and we'll see you next time. Hey, thanks for listening. You can follow us on Twitter at Staff Trenchcoat. Look for us on Spotify, iTunes, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Feel free to shoot us an email at staffandtrenchcoat@gmail.com if you have a book recommendation, and we hope to see you in the next episode.